Great. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Happy to be with you tonight. I'm normally calling in from Minneapolis, but happen to be in DC tonight, so I'm in a hotel with I don't know if it's blurred out, but I've got a big picture of George Washington on his dollar bill behind me. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I'll try to block it while I'm sitting here. Um, so tonight we want to talk about money a little bit, about financing your cooperative, about kind of how do we find this capital? Where does it come from? What does it look like? I was already introduced, but want to sort of frame this a little bit in sort of for tonight. I appreciate comments and questions as we go through the evening. There will be time at the end to have more discussion, but I always appreciate people stepping up with questions in the middle. I'll try to keep the chat open, so feel free to use that if you have questions or comments in the middle. So we'll make this interactive to the degree we can. Want to mention a little bit about Shared Capital Cooperative, where I work as the senior loan officer. Shared Capital Cooperative it's a loan fund. It's a small business loan fund. We work all across the United States. What makes us a little bit unique in the world of small business finance is that we only work with cooperatively owned businesses. So as was mentioned, that could be a housing cooperative, a consumer-owned grocery store, a producer-owned, farmer-owned producer co-op, or a worker-owned cooperative of any kind of business. But we only work with co-ops, and really our mission is around building economic democracy. And for the last 45, almost 50 years, we've been investing specifically in cooperatives to do that. One other thing that makes us a little bit unique is that we, as our name implies, we are a cooperative ourselves. So we are owned by the cooperatives that invest in us and the co-ops that borrow from us. Think of it as sort of like a credit union just for co-op businesses. And so we walk the talk, and we know co-ops inside and out because we are one, and we really base all of our work in the cooperative principles and the philosophy around creating equitable and sustainable democracy in our economy. And as you can see, we've got about 300 members across the country. We've got, actually, these numbers are a little old here. We've got about $26 million in assets, and somewhere between maybe 35 to 40% of that comes from our members, which includes cooperatives and individuals who support the work that we do. And we've got a portfolio of about 100 borrowers. I just want to throw this up here so you can get a sense of kind of where do we get our money from and where does our money go. And you can see on the left-hand side that where money comes from a lot of different places. And these are places where, you might find money directly from some of these sources, or you might work with a group like ours as sort of an intermediary to aggregate those dollars and make them available to you when you need them for your businesses. And so you see about a quarter or so comes directly from cooperatives who have been successful over the years and want to reinvest in the co-op economy. But we also turn to individuals and social impact investors and faith-based organizations and government sources and foundations. And we take all of that money and we lend it out across a portfolio that, again, while these numbers are maybe a little bit old, they're pretty close to where we are still today, with about a third of our dollars going to housing cooperatives, a little more than a third of our dollars going to worker cooperatives of all different kinds, about 20% of our dollars going to consumer-owned grocery stores, and the rest going to a variety of producer co-ops, multi-stakeholder cooperatives, or federations of cooperative enterprises. So again, today, I want us to understand, hopefully, by the end of this session, a little bit more about how loan and investment decisions are made, how to prepare your cooperative to find those dollars that you need to start up or expand your business, and really kind of unpack the mystery behind that as best we can, so that you can set up a healthy relationship between your cooperative and the people that invest in your cooperative. We'll talk about those things a little bit more today. I'll open it up. I want to open it up for just a moment to see if there's anything else folks in particular would like to get out of our session. So if folks want to just mention out loud or put into the chat if there are particular questions you might have or particular things you're hoping to get out of this session. Go ahead and list those out now, and I'll make sure that we can touch on those as best we can while we're working through our session. Pause for just a moment to see if there's any immediate feedback on that. Keep on moving here. So I actually would like to hear from you all, if you're comfortable sharing, talking about, this is really about a relationship between individuals who need capital, who need funding, who need money, and individuals or organizations who had those resources. And I think as everyone on this call knows, that relationship can be a terrible relationship that can ruin somebody's life. It can be a supportive and nurturing relationship that creates beautiful things. And so, and there's a lot of different things, different ways to relate to money in between those two spectrums or the ends of the spectrum. And so I would love to hear if people wouldn't mind sharing maybe early memories of money, kind of how you've thought about money and access to that over at different points in your life. Our relationship to money and capital changes as we grow and experience different points in our life where we need access to resources. And specifically, maybe when you're interacting with lenders or creditors or banks or other entities that may be making their money available for you to use in different ways. So I'm going to pause for just a moment and see if anybody would be willing to share. It's helpful to kind of hear about where you're coming from with this experience.
I have a question, and the question is, you said that the bank that you work with is a cooperative. Are there limits on what a person, like say for instance, the traditional lending pattern might be housing or food cooperative, but is there a limit on the creativity that a person can have in creating a cooperative? Like, is there like a list of things that you want people really to ask for? Is that something where your bank like open-minded about what people can create?
Yeah, and I think we'll touch on that a little bit at some points in the presentation. But as I mentioned, we only work with cooperatives, but as long as you are truly creating an authentic cooperative, we will work with pretty much any industry or sector out there. And we are always open to creative approaches to using the cooperative model and creative ways that it gets applied in our economy and in the things you want to accomplish for yourselves and for your group. I mean, ultimately, we still need to know that there's a valid business here, that there's an enterprise that can generate the money to pay the loan back. And we're serious about, sort of digging into that and unpacking that, making sure that we understand what this enterprise is about. But we appreciate creativity and we appreciate people thinking in different ways to use the cooperative model to accomplish what we need to accomplish.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi. My voice is a little like raspy right now. My name's Anthony Showens. I'm from Syracuse, New York. I guess to answer your question, like my earliest memory with money is just being young, and I was being a hairstylist and braiding hair at 16, and I didn't yet like do banking because I was just always told like to save your money and you just kind of put it in a jar, you put it, in your drawer or something like that. Until later on I started like, friends and being around them and their parents, and they would ask me what was I doing with my money, and I would just tell them I was just, saving it, putting it in my drawer or something. And then they introduced me like you need to get a bank account, and start saving and have a checkings and, have a checking a checkbook and learn how to like balance a checkbook and different things like that. So, but that didn't come to like later on, like not too later on, but about like 20 when I really started like understanding a little bit more about um how banks, work and the benefits and stuff like that of banking.
Great. Thank you for sharing. Appreciate that. Yeah,
Mhm.
we I recall, in school learning about sort of savings and paying your bills and balancing your checkbook and thinking about that. Though that was really exciting. And it's kind of fun when you're a kid, but then it gets pretty real pretty quick when you start to grow up and get a little older. Would love to hear if anyone else would care to share. And some folks have just joined. We're asking folks if they're comfortable to share experiences, personal experiences of money, maybe at different points in your life, interacting with banks or lenders or creditors, and how that experience went, and how you, if you sort of grew or learned anything, or how you grappled with that experience. I see
I
a hand up here
remember,
from
I
Ramona.
remember getting
Oh.
my very first car loan, and it seemed like it took forever to just get a loan for $5,500 for a freaking car. And I mean, so much of it was so ridiculous because I had just come out of graduate school and they kept asking me all these questions. And I'm like, I just came out of graduate school, dude, you know?
Mhm.
And it took it to me, I mean, it took 2 weeks for $5,500, when in reality, I didn't know that if I could just hang on for maybe, I don't know, 2 months, I could basically just pay
Mm.
that in my
Mhm.
new job, you know? And just not realizing and understanding how to manage that way, thinking that you had to work and put the money in the bank and do whatever, as opposed to actually having a strategy as to how you can manage. That was really, really, really interesting. And then another really interesting one was that when I finally got my place, it was a condominium, and I was ready to start. I was ready to start, just putting money away and building a portfolio. And when the person came to my condo, it was a young guy, but he was kind of experienced. And at the time, I don't know if you know this or not, but at the time, Franklin Fund was like super cheap to get into. It was like so super, and I could just put $50 away every 2 weeks. And I said, well, they have a social agenda, and I would really, really like to just begin to build on this fund. And the guy laughed at me and says, and he just tried to make it seem like it was ridiculous. And, 10 years later, I turn around and I'm starting to look at funds, and I'm like, if I had followed my intuition, because they never went through a downside.
Hmm.
And this is their social fund. So I said, you just need to know that and follow on what you know.
Mhm. Great. Thank you for that. I saw a hand up from Ramona. Did you have something to share?
I my first memory of banking is the little passbook that you took to the bank
Mm.
and if you wanted to deposit, if you wanted to take money out. My parents never had a checking account. So as an adult, I had to learn how to do a checking account. And it just what Marie just said about knowing about funds and stuff, I just feel like my entire life I've always been ignorant of how money works. I've even decided to start a small business, and I'm learning the most important thing when you're doing a small business is the tax strategy.
Hmm.
And I'm like, wow, because you think I got to make so much for this, I got to do that, but it's actually the tax strategy that you have planned for your business. So, and it's almost like we kind of learn about money as we progress through life. Some people went to school and they did accounting, they did the high level stuff. But down here, well, we didn't go to school for accounting and those type things. And even I've met some people that went to school for that, but they just said, yeah, that's fine if you're going to do it on that level. But there's a whole nother level, because small businesses actually are the ones that support this country, not the big corporations as much as they're in the news and media. Small businesses actually employ more people than major corporations. So I'm just so thankful for this um, co-op knowledge, because I am part of a food and kitchen co-op that we're planning to open here in Georgia in a food desert. And we're planning to be able to provide the community with fresh vegetables and fruits and products that the community wants, tapping into our local farmers and people that produce locally.
Mhm. Great. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else have maybe a final comment if anyone else wants to share? Great. I don't see anybody else. So yeah, appreciate those stories. I think, a lot of times this is about sort of, we're kind of stumbling in the dark a little bit, and we learn a little bit here and a little bit there about how to manage our money, what we can do, what we can't do. I know for myself, a lot of times I learned about money and relationships by making mistakes and by getting the wrong kind of credit card and not understanding payment structures and things like that. And that's a painful way and an expensive way to learn, but we do learn. Um, but I think ultimately, when we're thinking about creating a cooperative economy and the cooperative businesses within that economy, I think it's important to step back and think about, just as was mentioned earlier on, sort of like thinking about creative ways that we want to build our enterprise and thinking outside the box a little bit. I think there are a lot of ways that we can create healthy relationships with one another around money, that are supportive and not extractive. And so I think when we think about looking for money, we want to make sure that we are building that healthy relationship from day one. I know for our work at Shared Capital, and typically when we talk about how cooperatives should access capital and use capital, ultimately we want to make sure that the cooperative is still in charge, that this cooperative is still controlled by its members, and that we aren't undermining or changing the structure of the cooperative just to get the money in. Um, and there are folks that end up doing that, whether intentionally or not, sometimes, by kind of losing control of their co-op with investors, and kind of ultimately not being a co-op anymore. But part of this presentation is to let people know that there are better ways to do that, and there are lenders that are able to do that. Shared Capital is one of them, but there are others as well. And there's a lot of good folks working in the space that can make sure we follow these principles. A few of the other sort of co-op principles that might come into play when we think about money and our relationship to it. I've talked about democratic member control, but also member economic participation. The best dollars, the dollars that you can use and prioritize the way that you want, are your own dollars. And obviously, for some enterprises and groups of folks that are starting a co-op, the individuals and the members of that co-op may have cash and savings and reserves that they can invest in the co-op, and that's really helpful. We will also work with a lot of cooperatives where the members don't have a lot of cash in their pocket and can't afford to invest very much, but it's still important that you're investing something. When you're buying that member share and you're becoming a member, you want it to be a meaningful investment. Sometimes people ask, well, how much should a member share be to be a real co-op? And I think ultimately it's somewhere between, everything that the co-op needs and what is a meaningful amount for those members. You want it to be a little bit, you want it to be more than a cup of coffee, because that's not a meaningful investment, but you also want to make sure that you're not setting the bar too high so that you end up excluding people. When we think about, again, experiences with money and abuses in the banking system, a lot of it is about exclusion and pushing people out of the system or actually kind of abusing and extracting from people. We want to make sure that in our co-ops we're accessible and adaptable to our members' needs. We want the co-op to remain autonomous and independent. And I think one of the things that I actually think is as important in the big picture is making sure that our cooperatives invest in each other. And really, again, that's kind of what shared capital was designed to do, to be a space where co-ops can invest in each other. And oops, sorry about that. And strengthen the overall ecosystem and economy around us. So what do we need money for when we're starting up our co-op? Actually, I mean, I've got some things up here listed. We can, working capital, which is really just the money to pay the bills and keep the lights on while you're getting started up or while you're growing. You may have to buy stuff that you're selling or stuff that you're processing or turning into other things and selling. You may have to buy the equipment to do that stuff or run your business. You may have to, if you're renting a space, you may have to invest in that space and build it out for your business. You may have to buy real estate, depending on the nature of your co-op, or down the road if you've grown and have the resources and ability to do that. And we, in the case of converting a cooperative to worker ownership or cooperative ownership, you may have to have the money to just go ahead and buy that business or acquire another business to expand and grow your cooperative. I don't know if you all have answers to this yet, but I'd love to hear if anybody could share kind of what do you think for your cooperative? What kind of things do you think you need to spend money on to get going?
Um, I think in the beginning, like outreach and informational sessions for the community. Um, because my community isn't too, uh, I would say, well educated about the information of what cooperatives do and how they can benefit and why a community should buy into it. So I think our first step is, just doing more of the educational piece and outreach first, to see if it makes sense, to do it, even though we think it's a great idea and then the community will benefit from it. But if the community isn't buying into it, it's like, how can a co-op be supported?
Mhm.
And then I
Well,
think everything else follows. Like, once you have the people, then you can look into, building the business plan and knowing what your needs are, far as working capital, you know, um, operational capital, any renovations and different things like that will follow. Those are my thoughts.
great. Anyone else want to share what they expect to be spending money on as they get started?
Well, I think that for a cooperative, the ones that I know of, and it's like relationship building is important, like that you have the proper connections in your community, relationships in your community, even though, like, even say for instance, if someone borrowed from your bank, it's still good to have a good relationship with other banks, other financial institutions, and other people that do not have, like, say for instance, there are people with skills that I do not have, right? So then to build relationships with people that have skills that I do not have, because no matter how gifted we are, we can only do so much, right? So what we want to do is be able to share our vision, right? Get other people on board, build those relationships, and that way we'll have, people in our corner, and we'll have a foundation of people to work with that helps us to move our vision forward.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think kind of similar to what was mentioned, like professional services, like accounting, maybe legal,
Mhm. Great, thank you. Yeah, so there's a lot of different types of things we might be spending our money on. And the way that money comes into our cooperatives might be shaped different, be structured differently, might have different kinds of rules and terms about them, depending on how you're using those dollars. And so for different kinds of activity, you might have different kinds of money that you're tapping to get that work done. There are sort of some broad categories of what this money looks like and what kind of structure it takes. Um, you've got this, I'll just sort of put it up as a spectrum between equity and debt, and come to a definition in just a moment here. But debt has certain kinds of restrictions and rules around how you use it and how it gets paid back. Equity has a different kinds of sets of rules about how it's used and how it gets paid back. Um, but even within debt, there might be a senior loan, meaning a lender who's sort of has a first claim on repayment or on collateral if that's available, or a subordinate loan, which may be structured very similar to a senior loan, but they have to be more patient and have to sort of sit behind the other lender in order to get paid back. You might have what you call preferred stock, which is a structure for people to buy and invest equity into your cooperative. Um, and common stock here in this case is really just a fancy term for the member shares that you're buying. So that's you and your member and your co-members in your co-op investing your own money in there, as we talked about a little bit. And hopefully you can ideally find some grants or donations or family and friends and fools that are willing to put a few dollars into your dream to help you get it off the ground as well. And of course, that's kind of the best kind of money because you don't have to pay it back and often comes with fairly limited restrictions on that. To think about that spectrum and think about those different kinds of financing. So debt or a loan is really, you can kind of think about it as you're sort of renting the money from somebody else, and you're going to pay interest on that, and that's the cost of renting it. With a loan, the lender doesn't own anything. They don't have any sort of direct control over your business, and they don't have any direct claims on your business. But they might require that you put something up as collateral. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's another way to pay if things don't go according to plan. Whereas with an equity investment or an equity financing structure, the investor actually owns part of your business. And so that's a different dynamic. In the world of cooperatives, that's actually not necessarily a great thing. Again, because we want the members to own this business. We don't want outside investors to own it. And the upside is that while you're kind of giving up some ownership element to the business, those equity investors aren't on a payment plan right away. You don't have to start paying them back every month, and you don't have to pay back a fixed amount. Really, their ability to be successful or to struggle is really in line with your business. If your business does well, the equity investors do well. If your business does poorly, the equity investors get a very poor return on their investment and could potentially lose it. You call that dividends when you share out a part of the profits with them. And so they're taking more risk, and in exchange, typically in the economy, than the sort of the regular economy, they're taking some control in order to feel good about taking that risk with you. Now, when it comes to cooperatives, we don't want to give up that control. And so there is that thing, going back a few slides here, called preferred stock that I put there in the middle. And so that's a unique thing for the world of cooperatives. It's a kind of an equity investment where you're not giving up control. You're not giving up a seat on the board for those equity investors. You're not giving them a right to come in and tell you how to manage your business. And so they're getting a return, but they're not getting voting rights or controlling interest. And that's a significant difference between an investment in another kind of business, a publicly traded stock of some sort. You're actually getting a vote when you purchase stock. Now, if you only purchase a little bit of a stock in Apple or IBM, your vote doesn't matter much unless you have millions of dollars to invest, and at that point you start to matter within that company. So I think it's important to think about there is some creativity that has been established in the US around ways to get people to invest equity without giving up that control and that ownership. Where do we find this money? So there's a lot of stuff on this slide, and we can unpack it a little bit, but we've got sort of the kinds of money, loans and investments and grants and donations. And there's a lot of different places that co-ops can turn to. I will say in the big picture, there aren't nearly as many sources of financing for a cooperative business as there are for other sorts of business ownership. And I'm sure you may already be familiar with that. But we're fortunate in the US that the co-op economy is slowly but steadily growing. And every once in a while, there's a new entity that shows up that's ready to invest or make loans or provide financing to cooperatives. And so while it is still fairly limited compared to other financing that's available for other businesses, we do have some options in the United States. I'll kind of sort of a high level describe these things, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I put at the top there the members. So again, if you have the capacity and members have cash, that's the best money to invest because that's yours. You decide what you're going to do with that. You control it. And members could donate money to the co-op. And in some ways, when we're starting up our business, there's a lot of sweat equity being invested. And it's not something you can necessarily get back, but it's an important way of investing. Or you buy your shares, or you could have members buy preferred stock. You could have members make loans to the cooperative. The next category down there is something called CDFI and mission-based loan funds. A CDFI is actually a community development financial institution. It's a technical designation by the US Treasury given to mission-based lenders. And Shared Capital is a CDFI, as we are one of those mission-based lenders. And the purpose of CDFIs is to invest in community development of all different kinds. That could mean affordable housing or small business lending or consumer financing. So if you are looking in the world of CDFIs for investment, I think there are about 15 or 1,600 different CDFIs around the United States, but many of them are very specific and targeted, often geographically targeted, and sometimes a CDFI will only do affordable housing finance, or will only do community facilities for nonprofits, or will only do small business loans to traditional businesses. And so when you're looking for that kind of mission-based lender or CDFI, it's important to find a good match. Among those 15 or 1,600 CDFIs in the United States, there's probably only a dozen or more that really understand the nuances of investing in co-ops and lending to co-ops. And it's really helpful to find one that understands your mission. But we are also trying to always expand the number of CDFIs that will invest in cooperatives. You can turn to other cooperatives to finance your co-op. So we see this from time to time in local ecosystems where co-ops invest in each other or create lending pools for each other or different variations on that. And in many ways, Shared Capital, where I work, is a big national structured version of that, a way for co-ops to invest in each other. You might turn to crowdfunding. Crowdfunding can mean a lot of different things, but generally it means you're turning to your community supporters and neighbors and people who are in your local world and people who may find whatever business you're starting up to be useful in the future and are willing to take a risk with you early on and invest in different ways through stock or grants or donations. There's a little box on the right-hand side for banks and credit unions. There are banks and there are credit unions that will make loans to co-ops, but they're not typical. Sometimes it's an excuse, but banks and credit unions are regulated in a different way than CDFI or mission-based loan funds. And some of those regulations require them to require personal guarantees and require other sorts of structures that may not be ideal for a cooperative business. So you can turn to them for sources, but understand that you'll have to kind of fit into their boxes and fit into their standard approaches to lending and investing if you're going to work with them. Impact investors, and so this is really folks that maybe a family fund or wealthy individuals who want to put their money to good use in their community, social impact investors of different kinds. This is a continually growing industry. But again, even among the world of impact investors that are trying to do the right thing with their money, not a lot of them know co-ops, and that's another place where we're trying to expand more interest in cooperative finance. You can sometimes turn to foundations. Now, most cooperatives are not 501c3 tax-exempt organizations, and so it can be difficult sometimes to get foundation money into your business. And so often when we see co-ops that's trying to pursue foundation grants or investments, they might use an intermediary or a fiscal sponsor that is 501c3 or is tax exempt, and they can sort of adopt your co-op as a program and pass money through to you to help you get started or to grow. Again, that doesn't happen in all businesses. But it's at least worth looking around and seeing if that might be something that's available in your area or in the sector you're working with. I see a hand up from Naima.
Yeah, I was wondering, because I work for well, I have worked for a community foundation, trying to understand a little bit more about why the grantees have to be either nonprofit or fiscally sponsored.
Yeah, so traditionally in the foundation world in the United States, foundations themselves are set up to only invest in nonprofit enterprises or social enterprises of different kinds. And the best way to sort of the shorthand for figuring out what is an eligible social enterprise or service that's sort of helping with community development is to look for that tax exempt status. If a foundation invests its money or grants its money to a taxable entity or a for-profit organization, they actually can't always claim it as an eligible investment. Now, they could. Some foundations actually do invest directly into businesses that are not tax exempt, but they are willingly giving up some of their own tax benefits as an entity to do that. And so I'm not a tax expert, so I couldn't necessarily unpack the full background of why that structure is set up the way it is. But the shorthand is that foundations need to, for their own sort of tax accounting rules, and for the people that donate to them, they need to see that 501c3 or variation of tax exempt status in order to make their funds available. So that's why there are groups that are not kind of legitimate tax exempt, not legitimate 501c3, but are still doing good work. And that's the kind of the workaround there is that a foundation will find an eligible organization, a 501c3 organization, and use it as a pass-through entity. But that fiscal sponsor that's doing that really needs to be able to buy into and trust your enterprise in order to do that, because they are essentially saying to the IRS that you are kind of like a program of theirs, and they are supporting you because it matches their mission. And so if you're looking for a fiscal sponsor, you'll want to make sure you find one that sort of aligns with the purpose of your enterprise and what you're trying to accomplish in order to do that. And so that's why there are cases where those things align and it can make sense, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily happen real often, and it adds extra layers of reporting and structure that needs to happen. I mentioned that shared capital is actually a cooperative. So we are also not tax exempt. We are not 501c3. Many, and in fact, most CDFIs are. And so it's fairly easy for them to get grants to support the work they do. We found it important to really be a co-op in order to support co-ops And so we ourselves have to use a fiscal sponsor to get grants into our organization to support the work that we do. So it's definitely doable, but you make sure you have sort of mission aligned organizations up and down the chain.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Can a co-op include a charity?
There are, yes, you can have essentially like two corporate entities. One of them is for profit, one of them is nonprofit. And the nonprofit could be the 501c3 that gets grant funding. Again, not being a tax expert, I don't want to sort of talk too much about this before I get out over my feet. But that is something that can happen. And you'll just want to make sure that you have a good accountant and somebody who's familiar with tax rules to make sure that the money is being used appropriately, so that grants that are going into the 501c3 are being used the way they're supposed to, and money that's moving through the co-op that is being used and accounted for appropriately as well.
Okay, thanks.
The last one on the list there is public subsidies. And so, I think the most typical way that public subsidies might show up is either grants, donations, but it might show up as a low cost loan. And once in a while, it might show up as sort of a preferred stock investment. That's not as common, but it can happen from time to time. And when we're thinking about public subsidies, that might be a municipality, it might be a county, it might be a state program. It could be at different levels of government, or different organizations that work at the public level. Again, you don't see it happen every day, but if you can make the case that you are part of an economic development priority for your city or your county or your state, sometimes those dollars can be available.
So I have a question with respect to municipalities, et cetera. Are you aware of any cooperative enterprises that have been assisted by bonds or mutual bonds or anything like that, like housing or something?
It's been a long time since I've worked with an entity that was using public bonding as a form of finance. Typically, those are going to be larger projects. And so the times when I have worked with them haven't always been co-ops, it's been other kinds of community and economic development projects. But theoretically, if you have a very large development project, if you're building a large grocery store or a manufacturing company or something like that, you might be able to tap public bond financing to finance that. I will say that when, at that level, things become more complicated and more complex, and you have to bring in some more expertise to make sure it's all getting structured right. And there are also, various hoops to jump through in order to keep that public entity happy, and probably some ongoing reporting and requirements that you'll have to do over time, maybe involving hiring, targeting certain populations for hiring or something like that, or developing an undeveloped part of town or part of the county that they really want to see developed.
Yeah, that's really what I was thinking about, especially in certain areas where people just need housing and, it's, I don't know. It just came to my mind.
Yeah. Again, I
Thank
think
you.
most of the time those are going to be a fairly large development projects if you're going to go to that level.
Could that be something in what they call enterprise zones also?
That's an example. That's not a bond program, but that would be another example of a public subsidy. It's something that
Okay.
the government has set up as a program to support it. And if you fit the mechanics and the metrics of that program, co-ops should be able to utilize those just like any other development entity can utilize them.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thanks for the question, Marie.
Great. Any other questions from this slide? And you'll have access to this slide deck later, and you can always follow up with me afterwards. I mentioned the relatively small number of folks that are that are CDFIs that are lending to co-ops. This is kind of the short list. There are other folks that do work with cooperatives around the country. But these are the folks that you might sort of are most that we run into most commonly. And we have worked with every one of these funds at various times and various projects in different parts of the country. So while there's a small number of funds, some of them are larger. Capital Impact Partners is a fairly large fund. Rochdale Capital is probably the smallest and most recently formed. But they're very active already, even only being a couple years old. And because we're all fairly small funds, we often work together side by side, or one of us might be a lead lender and the other one might participate in the loan. So it's not uncommon if you have a slightly larger need for financing to be turning to more than one of these organizations. When you're shopping around or trying to find those lenders or investors for your co-op, I sort of mentioned this already, but it's kind of a matchmaking process. Any lender, any investor is going to be they're going to be driven by different kinds of mission priorities, different kinds of politics, different kinds of impact goals that they want to meet. Depending on the sector or industry in, they may have different metrics and standards that they need to have for their lending. The way where they find their money might drive what kind of loans they're willing to make. And ultimately, all of those things go into kind of what is their appetite for risk and what is their target market and what are they willing to do or not willing to do when it comes to financing. And so one investor or lender saying no doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to find that somewhere else if you can find a better fit with that with some other organization. When they are trying to figure out if this is a good loan to make or a good investment to make, there's a lot of stuff that a lender might be looking at. This is where they get into asking you all kinds of questions about the nuances of your business. We want to understand, sometimes people call these the C's of credit, and there's different variations people have, but any small business lender is going to want to understand cash flow, collateral, capacity, conditions, the character of the leadership. That's going to, I think, apply to any small business lender. But when you start to look at cooperative structures, there are some additional things that I think it's important for lenders and investors to understand, and ultimately for you to understand about yourself so that you can make the case to them that you're a safe place to put their money. We start with cash flow. Cash flow is really, it's in the name. It's the way that money moves through your business. So you sell something, somebody pays you for that thing. Now you've got cash. You spend it on your rent and on your labor and on your utility bills, and then you spend what you've got left on your loan payments or a return to your investors. And this is really what a lender wants to see, is that month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year, that you are generating more money than you're spending, and that you're taking that surplus and you have the ability to pay that loan back. The measuring stick for this thing is often called debt service coverage. And that's a technical way of saying that we want to know that you have enough money to pay the loan each month, and you've got more than what you need to pay the loan each month, because that creates a cushion. And so a lot of times the terms and requirements of a loan are about making sure that, yes, you've got a plan and your plan seems reasonable, but life happens, the world changes, the city decides to tear up the street in front of your business and nobody can get to your store for 2 months. The landlord doesn't pay attention and the roof collapses and now you can't do things for a while. The lender and investor really wants to make sure that you're covering scenarios that are over and above just day-to-day running the business. And so there are different ways that they cushion that to make sure that you've got more than what you think you're going to need to make those payments. Debt service coverage is really, like I said, if you have $1 to pay on your loan every month, we want to know that you've got 10, 20, 30 cents more than that. And so debt coverage of 1-to-1 means that you've got $1 to pay that $1 in debt payments each month. A debt service coverage of 1.2 means that you've got $1.20 for every dollar that you have to be paying back. So kind of a 20% cushion there. Some lender, it's pretty common that a lender will require a 1.2 debt coverage ratio. So that 20% more than what you need after you've paid all of your other expenses to pay that debt. Some lenders might require a 1.3 or a 1.4 debt service coverage ratio. So they want to know that you've got 30% or 40% more than what you need to make that payment. Typically, a debt service coverage is not necessarily negotiable, but I think a lot shared capital and the other co-ops lenders in this space try to be realistic and as flexible as possible about what we're looking for, including this and other metrics that we might see. I put collateral up there, collateral or security. And, this is the secondary source. This is the backup plan. If your business starts to fail or falter and you can no longer make payments on the loan, normally, if you've got a good relationship with your lender and you found a lender who understands who you are and what you're doing, you can go to them and say, hey, you know what? We've got this, we have this challenge, we have this problem, we need some time to figure it out. Can we adjust the payments for a little while until we get through this bad patch? And I think a reasonable lender will sit down with you and figure out how to restructure things for a little while until you get back on track. And this is, I think having that kind of relationship is I think fundamentally important for cooperatives, because we're here to create and invest in co-ops. So we want to also be able to adjust our expectations to the realities of your business. But ultimately, if we just think the business is not going to be able to recover, and it just seems unlikely that we'll be able to pay that loan back under normal circumstances, that's when we have to turn to the collateral. So we take the equipment, we have to sell it off, and we pay off the loan with that, or the inventory, or the real estate, whatnot. Most of the lenders on that page I showed you, along with shared capital, we're fairly flexible when it comes to collateral. We do make loans that don't have any collateral, and we find other ways to feel stronger about those loans, maybe having a higher debt coverage ratio or other things we might see in there to feel more confident about it. But typically with things like real estate purchases or large equipment purchases, we do need to know that there's some value in that real estate or in that equipment that can be used to pay off the loan in a worst case scenario. The measuring stick used here is something called loan to value or coverage ratio. And it's really the percentage difference between what you're borrowing and what the value of that collateral is. So if we have a $100,000 loan and you buy some equipment that's worth $100,000, that's a 1-to-1 coverage ratio. One thing that lenders will do, I talk about sort of these cushions or extra padding that we'll do in the math to make sure things are strong, is we will discount the value of the collateral depending on the kind of collateral and the condition of it. So obviously, if you buy a car, the moment you drive it off the lot, it's worth less than what you paid for it. And so we may say, you know what, we can only say that car is worth 50 or 60% of what you paid for it. So there might be a discount that goes into that. Excuse me. Personal guarantees. This is one area where cooperatives should differ from other forms of single-owned businesses. We do not require personal guarantees. I don't think anybody on that lender list that I shared requires personal guarantees. Most small business lenders will require personal guarantees. So you want to make sure that you understand what you're signing up for when you look at that. Capacity. Ultimately, can you do this thing? Excuse me. Do you have the right people doing the right jobs? If not, do you need assistance? Do you need some consultants or professionals who can help out with things? And that's okay. I would rather that you know where your weaknesses are, you know where your gaps are, because we can work together to figure out, you know what, let's see if we can hire somebody to do this part or somebody to do that part. Or let's see if we can train people in your co-op to get up to speed on those skill sets or that need. Much appreciate the ability for you all to be open and upfront and transparent about challenges, because then we can work together to figure out how to close that gap. And character. So, you know, when you're working with an individual who owns a business by themselves, you're really getting to know that individual, how they work, how they think. The character of a co-op is a little different because we're trying to get to know how this group thinks. We want to know, how do you address challenges as a group? How do you make decisions together? How do you deal with conflict? And so, you know, and the process of applying for the loan involves conversations and discussions and tasks and planning. And through that process, we're getting to know each other as well. And so you're really trying to build that case for good character while you're applying as well. Conditions kind of refers to the market you're working in. So who is your competition? Why should anybody buy your product versus some other product? We don't always need a market study, but there are certain sectors where it can be really important, like grocery stores, because it's a highly competitive market. We want to know that you've got what you need to get there. When it comes to the co-ops, the extra items that we think about include ownership. How does someone become an owner? What are the rights and responsibilities of owners? How does someone leave the cooperative once they're done being a member of the co-op? The governance of your co-op, we want to understand sort of what are your policies for operating things? Again, how are decisions made? How do you manage conflict? What is the relationship between members and board and management? They might be all the same persons, or they might be a larger group where you have that divvied up. Equity and patronage. So in this sense, you know, members are purchasing a share in a worker cooperative. Typically the value of that share doesn't change over time, but it might change in a housing cooperative. And if so, what does that look like? How are you paying patronage out to your members? So if you're profitable and you're making money as a co-op, what are you going to do with that profit, that surplus over time? You can pay it out to your members. You can hold on to it at the co-op and continue to grow the co-op's balance sheet, or you can allocate it to your members but not pay it out. You can leave it at the co-op for a while and kind of use members' money to, again, build a strong balance sheet for your co-op. Every once in a while, we see a co-op that does very well early on, and they get a little too generous and paying themselves out lots of dividends. And then we get to year 4 or 5 and they hit a bump in the road. And gosh, maybe we should have held on to some of that money so we would have extra cash for the business. Those are important decisions to be made. And we want, obviously, the surplus to be created and the members to get that. We want to make sure that we're weighing those scales in a healthy way for the co-op, so that we're not shortchanging the group in order to benefit the individual members. So where do we start? Again, this is really about a relationship. So talk to people, talk to lenders, talk to investors, talk to community members. They need to understand who you are. You need to understand their interests and their motivations. With a lot of these things, you don't need to know every little detail about your business. Not everyone needs to be an expert on your financials. Not everyone needs to be an expert about your market analysis, but you do want to have kind of a baseline knowledge for everybody. And so some of this is about making sure that, you know, individuals in your group have some knowledge and understanding of what you're doing, but you don't want those folks to get too far afield without bringing everybody else with them. So you want to make the case, but you also want to be making the case to yourselves so that you feel confident in what you're telling your lender and what you're proposing. Oftentimes We want to see a best case scenario and an okay moderate scenario, and I want to see a worst case scenario. Is how difficult can things go and still keep the lights on. Some of this too is about spreading that knowledge among the co-op members. And so if you happen to be the person in your group who was really good with spreadsheets and numbers or whatnot, that's great. You need that person. But part of your responsibility is also sort of translating things for the other members who may not be as comfortable with numbers and spreadsheets or as familiar with those. And so we want to sort of lift all boats with at least some knowledge. And ultimately, kind of for your business, this sort of ties to that market analysis. How are you going to compete? While you may be creating a cooperative economy, your competitor down the street is not. And so what's going to bring people to your services or your product or your organization as a cooperative? How will you compete with that? I will say that, one of the early little red flags I get sometimes is a group that says, well, people are going to use our service or buy our product just because we're a co-op and we treat our workers well. Well, there's some truth to that. There are definitely people who shop with their values in mind and who prioritize that, but you can't necessarily compete with the rest of the market simply on that alone. You still have to have a good product, a good service. You need to be, you have to have good customer service, and you have to be able to deliver those things well. So the mission and the values of your cooperative, while they should be highlighted and embraced, that in and of itself does not make a successful business. So be prepared as best we can. Things will always be changing. With a startup especially, I talked about kind of best case scenarios, worst case scenarios. One of the things we want to know is that, does the cooperative have the wherewithal financially and capacity wise and membership and leadership wise to get through 2 or 3 significant roadblocks that are going to pop up? I don't know what those are going to be, but almost every startup small business runs into some really difficult things at some point in those first few years. So again, another reason to create some cushions, to create sort of thinking through scenarios where things don't work out as planned, and what does plan B or even plan C look like? That's what I had for you all today. I'd love to open it up for other comments and questions. We can talk about anything that I covered. We can talk about things I didn't cover, but would love to hear your thoughts. Did I hit everything that you were hoping to find today? Is there something I didn't cover and you'd love to check in about?
I have a question with respect to individuals funding these funds or becoming members. So like say for instance, not an individual, but whatever. So say for instance, I am a co-op business and can I make a deposit to facilitate or help or be a part of this? Or do I actually have to be a lender? I mean,
No.
lendee,
Yeah. So you can, like I had on the chart earlier, you can make a loan to your own co-op. You just want to make sure that you've got a paper trail for it, that you've got a note that describes, okay, this is the amount I'm giving the co-op. These are the terms under which I expect to be repaid back. Or maybe you're, making another kind of investment, an equity investment, that will get paid back later, or a note that says, well, here's $500 I'm going to put into this thing and you don't have to pay me back for 3 years. You can decide how you want to structure that term, but I think it is very important that you make sure you paper it, that you've maybe had somebody review that who's sort of familiar with loan documents so they can see, oh yeah, that's legitimate, that makes sense. And that all parties are kind of doing it transparently. You can also just put money into your co-op if you're not expecting it to come back. You can always donate money to your co-op, but I think it's reasonable for folks that are putting more than a few dollars in to get it back at some point, if you're also putting extra work into the co-op. So it's definitely something that can be done. Typically, a member loan to a cooperative is going to be subordinate to other debts. So If you make a member loan and another lender makes a larger loan to the co-op, you will probably have to wait until they get paid off or get permission from them to make payments to the members. And there are certain sectors where that's standard, like again, in the world of grocery stores or larger manufacturing industries, there's a lot of capital that's needed. There can be millions of dollars that are needed to start up a grocery store. And so it is quite common to turn to members for loans in those circumstances.
Mark, I have a question in terms of just timeline. How, in your experience, how long have you seen in terms of the timeline from startup to a point of sustainability that it takes the cooperative to stabilize itself?
Yeah, I think that's going to change again depending on the kind of business it is as well and the sector you're in. And so there are cooperatives that can, and when we say stabilize, I think we're typically talking about generating enough revenue to pay all the bills and ideally make some surplus or profit at the end. There are some businesses that it might take a year or more. There are, again, kind of using the grocery store example just because it's larger and more complex. There are grocery stores we've made loans to that we don't expect to be profitable for 3 or 4 years sometimes. And so that's a higher risk investment. And sometimes that money costs a little bit more because you have to wait a long time for that to turn around. But yeah, I mean, again, some businesses that are fairly low capital intensive, kind of limited operations, might see a stabilization in 5 or 6 months. Some might be a year, some might be longer. When we make a loan, and again, when I think it's fairly common among other lenders in the co-op world too, is that we might start out with an interest-only phase on the loan. So your payments are lower during that time when you aren't generating a lot of revenue. And so that means you don't have as much stress on the financials of the co-op, but it also means that you're not actually paying the loan back yet. You're just paying rent on that loan and not paying the loan back. But it's pretty common that we would do that. It might be a 3 or 6 or 9 month phase where you have those lower payments, and then as you start to generate profits, then the payments go up and you actually start paying the loan back. Sometimes loans might be structured, it is called kind of royalty financing or revenue-based financing, where you only make payments when you are profitable. So there might be no payments for a little while, and then as you start to profit, a certain portion of every month's profits go to pay that loan back. And so there are different ways it might be structured. Again, if you've found a lender that you can have a reasonable relationship with, they should be able to offer some way of creating a little cushion early on for a business before it stabilizes.
Thank you.
When you're seeking a lender, is it, I was in a session earlier today about grant writing, and one of the things they talked about is to establish a relationship before you start writing asking for grants. Is that the same thing that you want to do for a lender?
Yeah, I would say typically that's a good idea. So, I'll get calls at all different phases of the development of a business. I'll get a call that says, hey, we've got this thing, we're getting this thing put together. In a couple of months, we might need some financing. Can we start talking to you about our plans? That's great. In fact, I like to get early calls because you don't have to have everything figured out before you start talking to somebody. And often we can offer feedback and say, you know what, in that circumstance with another business just like that, this is what we saw. Maybe you want to think about that as a part of your business plan. And it helps us to start to prepare ourselves and help you prepare for the actual application. Now, when you get to the formal application process, then you're probably going to have most of your questions answered, most of your stuff figured out. But even at the application process, you might not have all of the final details figured out, and that's okay too. So But I would say it's much easier for me to get an early call. Even like once in a while, I get the call of like, hey, Mark, I had this crazy dream last night. Wonder if I can do this. I would rather have that call very early and then check in with you from time to time as you're putting your plans together than get the call that we also get sometimes, which is, hey, Mark, I need $50,000 in 2 weeks. What can we do? And that's kind of impossible for us to do. So the actual timeline often from a formal application to when a decision can be made on the loan can be as much as 2 months. Sometimes longer if it's a very complex structure. Sometimes a little quicker if it's short and simple. And then it can be a couple more weeks to actually creating the loan documents and get the lawyers to review it and close on the transaction and make the dollars available. So it's always good. I think it's, and again, with all of the co-op lenders that I've worked with, we appreciate earlier calls than later calls.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering, like how competitive it is as far as like, is there like a really limited amount of funding and there are a lot of people applying? And I guess maybe I'll just say the other question, kind of related, is at what stage, and I guess it depends on what type of co-op as well, would you recommend to like apply for a loan versus some of the other funding sources?
Yeah, again, earlier is better generally, but there's always a little bit of kind of competition between lenders in some spaces with certain kinds of projects in certain geographies. But I would say overall, there is more demand than there are resources in the world of co-op financing right now. I think we can, we get a lot of inquiries and a lot of applications, and we can work with most of them, and we have the resources for most of them, but definitely not all. And so you might start with one lender and we realize, you know what, actually, we aren't going to be able to do this, or we won't be able to do all of it. Let's see if we can bring another lender in to help round this out and get you what you actually need. Um, I will say that if you're thinking of starting a conversation with more than one lender at around the same time, to be transparent about that so that we know that you're talking to other folks, they know that you're talking to us, because that can actually help our process. Again, we only have so many people and so much time in a day to do this. If we know that you can work with another lender and that's going to be a great relationship, there's no need for us to step in and push that. Vice versa, if we've been working with you for a while and we think we can move along with what we've got, there may not need to be a reason to seek out another lender. But it's always in your best interest to shop around a little bit and see what the options are. I think most of the lenders that I listed have fairly similar terms. Sometimes we each have particular programs where we can get the interest rate lower or adjust the fees or the structure in a more generous way. And sometimes we can't. And we'll try to, make sure that you know what those options are. But and sometimes we can somebody else has a little more expertise or more relationships in a particular geography, and we might refer people out for that as well.
Anyone else have any questions or
Yeah,
comments?
yeah, I have a question. I was just thinking then in your experience, what do you find are the most common challenges that co-ops find themselves in, especially when they're starting a co-op, the process of coming together and establishing, the role, the agreements for how they're going to work, and then how that plays out in practice. What are the key things that kind of go wrong, and what do you think is needed to prevent those common pitfalls?
Yeah. I think, well, I sort of, so one, I kind of touched on one of them is maybe being, I mean, you want to be confident in yourselves. You want to be optimistic about your plans. That's why you're doing them, because you think you can pull this thing off. But sometimes folks come in and they're just a little bit too optimistic about their scenarios. They think, oh, I'm going to get to $200,000 in sales in 6 months, and I'm going to be at $3 million in sales in 2 years. And looking at the kind of business they're doing and where they are and what's not, that it just does not look realistic at all. And so sometimes an early challenge is being overly optimistic and versus realistic about what's possible and what you can accomplish in a particular time. It's always a little bit of a challenge as a lender because I don't want to destroy your dreams, but I also want you to be cautious and realistic about how hard this is going to be. And, basing it on experience we've had with other maybe similar businesses to be able to share how you might or might not reach those actual goals. So I think that's one fairly common thing. I think that's common whether you're a co-op or not. But some of that being overly optimistic about how quickly you will become extremely successful. I think one other thing it's not real common, but you see it from time to time, is maybe an over-reliance in the co-op on one or two leaders in the group who really kind of have some particular set of experience, or maybe they've had their own business in the past, and people kind of lean on them to really know things and answer questions along the way. And I think there can be a little bit of that early on because we all bring different experiences, we all bring different capacities. You want to lean into your strengths. But before too long, you want to make sure that that person is not setting themselves up to be sort of the point person for everything at the co-op. And we want these to be truly democratic and flat structures as best we can, so that all members feel like they have an equal voice, an equal opportunity to bring their experience and to learn from each other in that process. And so once in a while, we spent some time talking with a group and we realized that nobody else is answering the question. Only that one person is answering the questions. And so let's dig into that a little bit and see what's going on. And again, there's a little bit of a natural element of that early on, but we want to make sure that that doesn't stay that way over time. One of the things that we're doing when we're doing our underwriting is we're underwriting those numbers and that, the cash flow in the market and all of those things. But we're also underwriting the ability of the co-op to be, again, a democratic institution and to be an economic democracy and to be really driven and led by all of its members as best we can. So I think that's another pitfall that we sometimes run into as well.
Mark, you mentioned something that just dawned on me. You mentioned that the fact that you look at data, that you look at previous loans that you've done compared to incoming loans. How much do you rely on that kind of data in terms of your decision making when it comes to loan making?
Well, it might not influence the final decision making, but it will influence how we advise you along the way and how we offer feedback on your projections or your business plan. And so we do want to be able to say, you know what, everybody, you're proposing this shoe repair shop. Well, every other shoe repair shop I've worked with had these 3 things happen, and it doesn't seem like you're incorporating that into your business plan. And so it's nice to be able to do that. I will say that because we work across all different kinds of businesses and all different kinds of sectors, there are very few sectors where we have real deep experience because we're working with a different kind of business all the time. But I will say that like grocery stores, food retail, housing cooperatives, and a few other sectors where we've seen it over and over and over again. We've seen successes, we've seen failures. We are going to rely on our learned experience there in our decision-making process. Again, ultimately, hopefully, it gets incorporated into the conversations and the feedback we give you so that you can adapt and adjust, and then we get to a better decision at the end of the day. I would rather we work together to evolve and kind of dress things than we kind of rush things and just get to, sorry, we have to say no. It's not like we can say yes to everybody, but I think with a little more attention and conversation and working together on things, we can say yes more often.
Thank you.
Yeah, I may have missed where this was explained, but the feedback you're talking about, is this something that's like going on throughout the lending process? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, again, the first conversation is usually kind of an early inquiry call. It's a let's introduce ourselves to each other. Tell me about your dreams and your plans and what you want to try to put together with this co-op enterprise. And then from there on, we'll figure out how quickly we're going to move to an actual application. And if you're sort of fairly, you've moved along and you've got a lot of work done, maybe we're having one or two or three conversations before we say, you know what, it looks like you're ready to actually apply. Some groups, we have early conversations and then we talk 3 times a year for 2 years, and then they're ready to make an application. Some groups we talk more frequently for a few months, and then they're ready to make an application. So it really changes a little bit again, depending on the capacity of folks and kind of the time they have to put into stuff, and also our time. We only have so many people on staff, and we want to provide as much support and feedback as we can to as many people as possible. But there's only so many times we can do that. And so sometimes we might say, you know what, it looks like you actually need somebody to kind of help you through some of this process or that process. Here's a TA provider, here's a consultant, here's an organization that could help you figure out those parts. And once you've done that, then let's come back together and see where you're at and move forward from that point.
Are there any more questions?
I've got one more. You said earlier on, and sorry if you've actually answered this already and I didn't hear it, but I think earlier on when you were talking about the different kinds of like equity, debt, that kind of thing, I think you said that although cooperatives are increasing in the US, and I'm in England, by the way, in the US, I think you said that there's more opportunities for funding or investment for businesses other than cooperatives. Yeah, so I just wondered why is it not attractive? I understand the bit to do with like maybe how foundations may not fund co-ops because it's connected to their tax breaks and charitable stuff and things like that. But in terms of people investing, people that invest in businesses, why are cooperatives less attractive?
Oh, yeah, I think there are a few things that go into that. One is just a lack of familiarity. So they're like, what? I don't understand that model. And most, a lot of lenders and investors, they've got boxes, and if you don't fit into one of the boxes, then they can't work with you. There is also an element of, most small businesses, again, startups might be one or two, maybe three people that are coming together to do this thing. And a lender or an investor, it's easier if they say, you know what, this one person is going to make the decisions. So I need to get to know this one person, and that's who I'm going to trust. And we're going to require a personal guarantee. So their assets are on the line. So they're going to be held accountable to everything. And when we're making a loan to a co-op, we're making a loan to this group of people. And it's harder for a lot of lenders to really understand how to evaluate that and how to understand how this group of people can actually create more strength. But also how this group of people might need a little more time to make their decisions as a business and might have slightly different processes for that. And so that again becomes a thing that's out of the ordinary, and doesn't quite fit into the requirements or the boxes that a lender or investor needs. And they won't be interested in because of that. And then there are a few that are just like, what is this crazy socialist, communist, wacko, revolutionary stuff? I'm not going to be a part of that. And
Yeah.
so there are some that are politically disinclined to support co-ops. And so, like I had with that little funnel, all those various different things, regulation or sort of standards and norms, or their experience and understanding how to evaluate a business, or their political orientation might scare them away or motivate them to make a loan to a co-op.
Mm, mm. Okay, thank you. And just to comment, just for everyone as well, you whenever I attend anything that is American based, people always talk about fiscal sponsorship, and it seems to be so common there. In the UK, it's hardly ever done.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I hope that that's one of the American influences that we can get here and would be actually useful to us, because I think it's really essential.
Hmm. Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. I did not know that. Thanks for sharing.
And that I think that made me think why credit unions aren't known to support cooperatives, because aren't they some type of cooperative as well?
Yeah, credit unions are sort of a unique space. Yes, credit unions are actually cooperatives, but I used to do a little more work in the world of credit unions and be a part of a board of a credit union in Chicago. It sort of frustrated me that there are a significant number of people that work at credit unions or on the board of credit unions that don't even realize that they are a form of cooperative. And so there's a little bit of lack of sort of awareness or education there. With credit unions, it's actually important also to understand that most credit unions or many credit unions are consumer credit unions, meaning they are designed and have experience and systems and structures to support individual people with their personal savings and personal loans and personal credit building and things like that, auto loans, loans to individuals. And a lot of credit unions are not small business lenders. And so you shouldn't expect them to suddenly make a small business loan to a co-op, because they don't make small business loans to any business. So you do want to make sure that if you're going to a credit union, first of all, that they are a credit union that actually makes small business loans, so that you could even fit somewhere in their products. And then also, most credit unions fall under a similar regulation. It's a different set of regulations than banks, but in the US they do have sets of regulations, and sometimes that limits their ability to lend to a co-op. Now, we have worked with a number of credit unions over the years as co-lenders into a business, and often it's a great experience. So there too, shop around and make sure you ask, but you can't assume that they're going to be able to simply because they are a co-op.
Do anyone else have any final comments or consider there?
Well, if there's no other questions, I want to just thank Mark for his time. And Mark, I must say this, man, you always show up, man. And I really appreciate that and recognize that. Um, to the people who are on this call, I do want to just let you know that you will be getting a certificate of completion of this 12-week Black Coopnomics Academy. So that is forthcoming to you as well. And then I think Diana has reached out to ask for your testimonies, letters of support. So if you can accommodate us in that way as well, we certainly appreciate it. And then lastly, for you to go back, if you haven't done this already, to go back and complete the survey, because that is also critical, important information that we will utilize going forward in terms of structuring Co-op Academy sessions, evaluating our speakers, and evaluating us as an organization. So if you can find time to do that, that'd be certainly helpful as well. Amal, do you want to share something before we let folks go?
Absolutely. Like Ron mentioned, I want to thank Mark. Thank you so much for your time today and your valuable insights. It was a really enjoyable session. And then I also want to thank everyone and appreciate everyone's dedication for being a part of this 12-week program. I think it takes a lot of time and dedication to be a part of this. And we're really looking forward to seeing you in all of our future endeavors around co-ops. So yeah, and Mark, if you want to add anything before we close for tonight.
No, just always happy to help out. You've always got a great group of folks in this academy, And you know, I do this work because I love it, and because we need to do this work. We need to change our economy, and you all are it works because you are successful. So thank you for all your work, and to everybody who's on this call. Let's make this economy work for people rather than the other way around.
Well, before I go, I do want to just give one special shout out to Anita Servington, because she's been participating from England. And so it's the hour difference, and right now it's sleeping hours there. I think 11 or 12 o'clock, somewhere around there. So I do want to just give a shout out to Anita for her continuity and consistency and showing up in this space and sharing what she has shared. And
Thank
I
you.
want to give
Also, Paulette is also from England.
Paulette.
Paulette Hakeem, yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we have Paulette as well.
Thank you for all that you do and everybody's contribution. We've learned so much from you, and we're happily gonna give our testimonies and keep in touch.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you all. All right, Mark. I don't know if you're traveling back to DC today or tomorrow, but enjoy your stay while you're here in the district.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Rob, appreciate it.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.